Welcome, everybody, and good morning to all of you who are here. And also, welcome to our digital audience joining us from near and far. My name is Elina Troscenko, and I work at the Global Research Program on Inequality, GRIP, which has the honor and pleasure of collaborating with Bergen International Film Festival, BIF, and Bergen Global, where we are today, around this breakfast event entitled Perspectives on Futures of Post-Conflict Societies. And using the opportunity that many prominent filmmakers are coming to Bergen, to BIF, we wanted to invite one of them to join us for a conversation on post-conflict societies. And we are honored to have here, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, Akoul de Mabior, who is visiting Bergen with her documentary, No Simple Way Home.
Thank you.
Akoul is a South Sudanese filmmaker, currently based in Kenya, and her film No Simple Way Home is a personal film about politics, nation building, and belonging in South Sudan. Through personal conversations with her family members, Akoul in her film explores notions of home, as well as the complex and challenging world of a new state being built. And we're also very happy to have with us here today 3 wonderful scholars joining us for the conversation. Sarah Tobin, who is an anthropologist specializing in displacement and migration issues in the Middle East and Africa. Torunn Wimpelmann, a political ethnographer whose current focus is on intersections between gender and political and legal orders in contemporary Afghanistan. And joining us digitally, I hope you can see her on screen, is my dear former colleague, Carmelisa Rosario, an anthropologist with experience on poverty, vulnerability, inequality, and gender issues from Southern, Central, Western, and Eastern Africa. She's actually joining us from her fieldwork in northern Mozambique. Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us in this conversation. So we at GRIP focus on various dimensions of inequalities and the ways they shape and frame our world today, and also the challenges that contemporary societies face. Profound inequalities are not only source of unrest and conflicts, but they are also challenges and impediments to building just, equal, stable, safe, and prosperous societies, and as well as their challenges to human well-being as such. Akoul's film is set in a context of a country that is in a state of fragile peace, widening inequalities, and vulnerable and exposed climate-related shocks. And also, it's a place where some 2/3 of its total population are estimated to be in need of humanitarian assistance. At the same time, it is also a place of new beginnings and hope and expectations for a better future. The film, among many other topics, also reflects and contemplates over challenges that come after a liberation struggle. And we would like to use this opportunity to talk with her and the rest of the panel about the challenges and complexities of building futures in post-conflict societies. So let me start by with the challenges. What would you consider the most challenging elements of post-conflict periods in the context of your work? And I know that all of you are working in different regional contexts. And of course, the challenges, they're many and very wide, but given your line of work, what you see as the main challenges? Because the conflicts in themselves, of course, are always devastating and bearing a lot of human suffering, but then the aftermath comes, and it's not an easy period either. So there's a lot of hopes, but also a lot of insecurities. So what do you see as the main challenges? And Akoul, maybe we can start with you.
So I always like to start by saying that I didn't make the film from an authoritative position. So I'm not an expert on South Sudan. I'm from South Sudan. Also, I haven't spent that much time there. So I consider myself South Sudanese, but don't have a strong connection with the space, and was trying to do that through the film. But questions like this are also things that we try to explore through the film. Like, what is it? So the way that we phrased it or framed it is, what is the vision beyond the struggle? So I'd say what we found, or how it seems to me, is that we derive a lot of meaning from the liberation struggle. So many people sacrificed and got behind it and believed in it, struggle for freedom. And sometimes I also get questions about why the conflict in the first place. And the situation was really terrible for people in the south of Sudan. So also I'm from South Sudan. And once the country split in 2011, so after, in a sense, we won the war, or after the war, after the struggle, there's euphoria and the feeling like, this is our time. So this is what we fought for. This is what years of sacrifice, so many people's lives, it was for us to have our own country, or for this kind of outcome. There was also possibilities of other outcomes, but people were happy with the outcome. We came to secession and an independent country via a referendum, and it was overwhelmingly in favor of splitting the country. So there was mass euphoria, and everybody was like, people were flooding in, So also another thing about the film is exploring what it means to come home, to come home, or to come back to a space. A lot of young people are coming home to a place that they've never been to. And at this point, like 2 years after independence, so independence and the secession is in 2011, and then 2 years later, the new country goes into a civil war. So we're coming from Africa's longest running civil war in Sudan. And then at the end of that, there's a referendum and a secession, and now we have our own country. 2 years later, we have our own civil war. So the country's 2 years old and is at war. So why is it that after independence, after the struggle, after you win the war, or that things fall apart? And I don't know the answer. I guess I've just explained the question in a different context. But
no, but it gives a nice context, and to think about also that what is the aftermath really?
Mm-hmm.
Because suddenly there's again a new conflict coming up, right? Mm-hmm. So the challenges related to actually building a sustainable peace, mm-hmm, as well is a challenge. Mm-hmm. Sarah, would you like to continue?
So I have done work with Syrian refugees for around a decade now. And I think there are several things that I'd like to build off of, but also add. I mean, this trajectory of hope and euphoria and gathering and the sense of new unity is absolutely the same sentiment that Syrians expressed in especially the early days. Wendy Perlman, whose work I admire tremendously, has a book entitled "We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled." And that feeling that people are together to such a degree that you can shake the very foundations of the land, right? I mean, this is absolutely also part of the Syrian experience. And, you have the same issues with the aftermath, where the political regime is the biggest challenge. And in the case of Syria in particular, the fact is that the old regime is still in power. Right, Assad is still in power. And what that means is that for people who have advocated for his ousting, for his removal, which is a large majority of the country or former country at this point, the possibility of return and rebuilding is still not in play. And so I think the durability of these authoritarian regimes becomes a major obstacle in the aftermath of these kinds of uprisings and domestic crises. And that durability can also prompt these civil war and these kind of domestic national contests, power contests that occur. I also think that this is something that the film also discusses that I think is also very important in these kinds of conflicts and post-conflict societies, and that's the issue of natural resources. Because suddenly you have access to, in the case of Syria, oil. What do you do with oil? Who controls oil? I mean, this is also the case right in South Sudan. And what does it mean to be in power and in control of natural resources within this context of these power vacuums? So I think that those are the two elements that I think are so important in post-conflict considerations: the durability of authoritarian regimes and the power and control over natural resources. And I think that's probably a theme in all of these countries as well.
Yeah, we can see it as a repetitive, right, issues in contexts, various contexts, regional contexts. Yeah. Torunn, Afghanistan.
Yes. I think in Afghanistan, we could perhaps talk about two aftermaths. So the first one in 2001, when the Taliban was overthrown by the US-led invasion and a different government installed. And then you have, of course, last year, 2021, when the Taliban expelled, or the US withdrew and the Taliban seized power. It's, in many ways, I think these moments were very different, at least from the perspective I saw it. In 2001, power was very unsettled and everything was much more up for grabs. So now, of course, in 2021, power feels very settled. The Taliban is in very much in control, at least for now. So I think I wasn't there in 2001, but I imagine hope to have been more euphoric in the sense that Akoul was mentioning it. There was some hope that 3 years of conflict and isolation was over, and in some groups, population groups, a sense that the future was kind of limitless. Now, I think, of course, last year the Taliban were certainly euphoric, but for other people, it was in the urban areas, I think, more despair and fear, and then in rural areas, some hope perhaps, but much more quiet that the violence of the war was over. But I think, I mean, the Afghanistan case shows that aftermaths are very different, and everything depends on the political situation. But this kind of urgency in the very beginning, at least, that everything is up for grabs, and the kind of consequent jostling of position, I think is perhaps a very important aspect of these situations where there is both hope and fear and this kind of we have to act now, otherwise we will totally lose out, that many different groups feel.
Thank you. Carmelisa?
Yes, it's so interesting to hear about the other experiences and how many things really overlap or are similar. I really liked Sarah's approach on the natural resources and on the governments, which I think are really important. In the case of Mozambique, I can also talk about several aftermaths. So we have the aftermath of the Liberation War that ended in 75. Actually, it ended in 74 with the agreements right after Portugal became a democratic country. So it signed agreements with all its former colonies, and that's the first aftermath. And that certainly was euphoric. Everyone does talk about, the proclamation of independence in a stadium. Everyone remembers that it rained. So this physical really feeling that stays with you. I wasn't there. I wasn't born. Well, I was actually born when I was a baby. But this recollection is also very strong, that it's as if I had been there, because this is how it's told. Then we had a civil war, and I say this carefully because both our liberation war and the war afterwards were also part of global conflicts, which was the Cold War at the time. And the way the war started was sort of an aggression war from the Ian Smith regime in Rhodesia at the time, and then afterwards the apartheid regime in South Africa. But then it did turn into a full-blown civil war in which grievances, internal grievances, stood the regime and the way we were being governed and their choices, economic choices and political choices, how it affected the rest of the country. So after that war, what happened actually, and I did field work afterwards, some 10 years after the war ended, started doing field work, eight years, and there was silence about the war. People did not want to talk about the war. It was a terrible war. It was a violent war. Until Sierra Leone, it was the most violent civil war in Africa. And until now, people recall how terrible it was. And what people were is glad that it was over, and they didn't want to mention it at all, lest it would return. And what I find, in addition, so natural resources at the time was not so much the issue. It is now. We have some conflicts now. We have a conflict in the north where I am now. And now it's openly about access to resources, so access to opportunities, unemployment, a common theme across many African and Middle Eastern countries, with a large youth population that is unemployed and without access. And what I find ironic that, for example, aging European populations are ruled by young politicians, whereas young African countries are ruled by the old guard, and that refuses to go away. Some of the countries are making changes, but largely we are governed by the older generation, the freedom fighters, and some of them their pupils, but that are not necessarily young. And what has been difficult, so in the beginning, in the two first aftermaths, because we will have another aftermath, I don't know after how long with the new conflict, but in the two first aftermaths, reconstruction, it was a major challenge, given that we had very few resources. In both cases, we became very dependent on foreign aid, and we still are. And that kind of affects how we govern and how priorities are set and all this. But the second thing is reconciliation. So the independence was a strong cause, and several different movements were behind it. But afterwards, deciding how to govern and what is the vision of the country, then that became a problem. And even after the Civil War in '92, when the peace accords were signed, there wasn't true reconciliation. There was the shutting down of the guns, but there was no reconciliation. And it was very easy, even after 20 years, to return to exactly the same rhetoric and for feelings of exclusion that have to do, of course, with the government that has stayed, or the regime that has stayed on and is still on, and is closing the access to ever more riches now that we have natural resources to access to. So it becomes even more unstable. But it comes from not having a true reconciliation, and we did not have the process, especially when we decided to sort of silence ourselves and be afraid of talking about the war, which I think it was a theme also after the Second World War in Europe. By the way, do not mention the war.
Thank you, Carmelisa. You're touching upon very many interesting points, and some of them we will return back to, as for example, the generation dimension in building up the country. So all of you have somehow also touched upon already my next question, which are about visions for the future in the aftermath and beyond the struggle for the people. So what do you see? What are the dreams and fears of people regarding the future in societies affected by conflicts? Because there also are, we mentioned power struggle as one of the challenges, and so there are also maybe different versions of the future, how people see and vision it. And also we see that there are places where people don't see the future anymore because of the conflicts, right? And it's also affects the society as people are migrating. And also this disappointment and disillusionment of the hopes and euphoria that has been there can also be a ground for a new conflict. As, for example, from my line of work, and I've worked in post-Soviet contexts, the color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia and Kyrgyzstan have often been framed by this disillusionment of what post-Soviet independence did not bring. So, but of course, these aftermaths, and there are many of them, as we can see, it's not just a one-time thing, it's a repetitive pattern, even sometimes, are also experienced very differently regarding who remains in power, of course. But so, Torunn, maybe you could start. What would you see as the visions of the future?
Well, I think now it's, I mean, the Taliban and many other people certainly had a vision of an Afghanistan that was free of foreign occupation and stable without violence. Perhaps they also imagined some kind of prosperity, I think economic self-sufficiency. I would say that most of that has not turned out so far, at least. The country is desperately poor now. There's poverty is increased. They say that up to 90% of the population are not food secure. And there has also been violence since the US withdrawal, like some especially targeted religious minorities. But of course, the situation is overall much more peaceful than it was before last year. I think for many other people, the disillusionment is the main, disillusionment and fear is the main kind of experience. The country has become incredibly repressive, I would say, totalitarian. And there's no space for any kind of criticism, however kind of muted, towards the government. And the government, the Taliban government, is extremely exclusive in the way they make appointments. So it's only almost very much from their own ranks, with some exceptions. But for young people, it's very hard to get any kind of position, even if they have education. And I spoke to some from the ethnic Hazara group when I was there in the summer, and they said none of us can get a job because we're the wrong ethnic group, and they're all planning to leave the country. But it's just so hard now with all the borders being closed. So the only place they can often go is to Pakistan, and even that is difficult. Some go illegally to Iran and Turkey, but so yeah, I think the vision is, and for women, of course, we will talk about more about that later. There is desperation and depression, I would say.
I think in the context of South Sudan, maybe it will relate to other places as well. There may be a sense of waiting for another visionary leader to help us define who we are, or to define what gives us purpose. So I feel like with the liberation struggle, or struggles for freedom and justice, it gives so much meaning and purpose to people. We are fighting for our freedom. That's clear, and it gives us an identity, or it gives people an identity. And we know who we are when we're fighting for freedom, but we don't know who we are when we're free. I think that waiting for a visionary leader, waiting for this one architect who's going to design where we go next, it's a mistake. Those people are often targeted, and they get rid of them. And also, who knows if one person is going to be able to figure out an architecture for everybody and everything. I feel like those things must come collectively. And if there's these authoritarian regimes that don't allow people to even talk, to even question, to even challenge the way things are, then we can't collectively design where we want to go. So I feel like people are confused. Like, how do we, who are we? And then you get people individually. It can be where you have patriarchal societies, like default patriarchal societies. You can just have a man, one man. Like, you could just be walking down. I could just be walking down the street or climbing the mountain. We like to climb the mountain in Juba, and this one guy can be like, "You cannot wear that here." You know, like, he's an authority unto himself. He's defining what it means for me to be a South Sudanese woman in this moment right now, because he's given that authority. You cannot wear sunglasses on the mountain, I was told once. I was like, what? I was like, that doesn't, please just explain how that even makes sense. But he's an authority unto himself, and he's given the authority to define in the moment what it means for, you know, what is proper dressing in South Sudan or things like that. And people are just sort of doing it as we go in this really strange way. And so I feel like things like films and creating moments where we can give each other space to talk about, like, what does it mean for me to call myself South Sudanese? Or what does it mean for me to feel ambivalent and struggle to define my South Sudanese identity, and to do that without shame, and also to admit that we don't know yet. That's a thing that we're, in a sense, not allowed to do. We can't say, like, the country is so young, so we don't actually know yet who we are and where we're going and what is best for us, and we need to figure that out collectively.
So also searching for new visions.
Yeah.
Right? Being actively in that process. Sarah, do you want to expand? Or?
Yeah, I think that one thing I've seen working with Syrians in diaspora is that all of the dreams are channeled through the vision for their children and their children's futures, and that those change over time. So as an example, one of my good friends was the manager of a Save the Children kindergarten in Zaatari camp, which is the largest refugee camp for Syrians in the world. And she's been there managing this camp since the very beginning. And she said the first few years, the kids would come in and they would hear airplanes flying overhead, just commercial aircraft, I mean, normal kinds of operations. But the kids associated so strongly the sound of aircraft flying overhead with being bombed, that the kids would scream and cry and hide under their desks and wet themselves in fear. And over time, these kids got older and they would go to school and move on. And now it's been 10 years, and the kids that are in the kindergartens have no memory of Syria. They've never been there. They've never experienced this. And now the airplanes fly overhead and there's no response. And so this idea, and I want to go back to a comment that Carmelisa had made, which is, I think, is so important in this question of dreams and also about identity. Who do we want to become and how do we get there is so importantly shaped by the narratives that the parents are constructing for their children. And even without this warfare context and conflict environment, I often find myself as a parent wondering, what do I tell my child? What do I tell my child about racism in America? What do I tell my child about poverty and inequality or homelessness? I mean, these are like real questions that we have just as middle-class parents in a secure environment. What do you tell your kids about the way that your parents died brutally at the hands of a regime? What do you tell your children about what they should hope for, what they should believe in, what they should do? And this is what consumes so many of the Syrians that I've spoken with over the years. This role of silence, of forgetting, of memory in shaping that narrative of dreams becomes really, really important when you start considering that these post-conflict environments are long-lasting and durable. And so I think the question of dreams is so important, but the question of how to dream, I think, is the real linchpin to trying to make it happen.
Thank you. And very interesting points. And all of you touched upon younger generations, because the future and the visions of the future, we also link to the younger generations. And Karmelisa, you also mentioned how in African context, countries that consist mainly of younger generations are ruled by elder generations. So what is the role of young generations in these post-conflict spaces? And is there a place for them to move forward things? And how would you could comment on that?
Yeah, I was reflecting on that, on dreams and aspirations, and whereas I think that in the aftermath of the independence, first the freedom fighters were young, and they were the ones who became the leaders, and they still are. And there was a lot of hope, and there were a lot of dreams at the time. And perhaps that extended to a large part of the population, of course. And this means that there was at the time a strong place for the youth. They were the ones that were at the helm of these new countries. They were idealistic. They really had the better hopes for the future for themselves and the country. But now, as these new conflicts, either as conflicts rage on or new conflicts emerge, what is coming up is exactly the lack of dreams for the youth. I think, as I said, this theme of lack of employment, access to opportunities, in the case of the conflict right now in northern Mozambique, the insurgents are called Al-Shabaab, and Al-Shabaab is the youth. And yes, they are tied to this transnational Islamist extremism movements. But at the same time, there is also this narrative about lack of employment, about being about opportunities being taken away from them, and a strong rage against a minority elite that is also an elite that is perhaps not from the places where they are. So this issue of identity and being ruled by people who do not share the same identity also comes up. Even if we want to sort of at least in Mozambique, we like to minimize the effects of ethnicity and ethnic identity, but it has been growing, and it's sort of in somewhere in the back of the conflict. So it sort of adds fuel. And I think that the fact that there is this desperation and lack of hope that leads either disgruntled or youth without perspectives into the conflict. What people have been saying is, for example, that for small sums under $100. People just joined the fight, and this means that perhaps there's less ideological attachment and more material attachment to these conflicts. But it's also this tradition of resolving conflicts through violence, or resolving differences through violence, that kind of takes away ways of dreaming. So people feel that they have no, and that don't have a dignified life, that there is too much inequality, that some people are living well, whereas others are not. And this sort of strips away slowly potential dreams and hopes, and the only way is to engage in violence. So I'm not sure I answered the question.
No, but thank you for expanding on that. And we also see it as a topic that is repeating itself about both dreams being taken away, but also opportunities being taken away. And you also touched about it in Afghanistan's context. But any of you would like to maybe comment also on this place of young generations in this moving forward?
Yeah, one of the things that we'd like to come up in conversations through the film, especially in South Sudan, is, or we'd like for the conversations to be intergenerational. So to have in the space, we don't want to consider generations in isolation. Like, okay, we'll have a screening for the youth, and then we'll have a screening for the old guys, like the old guard or whatever. And there's a sense of there's a way that we talk about generations where we assume, or I don't know, we talk about them like they're in isolation, and as if we don't interact, or as if we cannot gain from each other. Like the youth can stand to gain from an older generation can stand to gain from a younger generation. And I think a lot can be gained in a space where the two interact. I feel like in the film, my mother and I and my sister are like these two different generations. And my mother is from the generation of freedom fighters. So one of the questions was, is that generation the right generation to move us beyond the struggle? And can they let go? So there's a sense also from that generation of treating the younger generation as a threat and trying to eliminate them because they want to hold on to their positions. But what can we stand to gain from each other? And how can we stop regarding each other as threats? Because we interact, we exist in our contexts, in our environments together. And then in terms of the hopes and dreams and aspirations of young people in particular, but I mean everybody, old people also have dreams and aspirations. Older people. The sense, or what I see, it's like there's very few things that people look at and aspire to or look like they work. This person's life looks like they're not suffering. They look like they're prosperous, and usually it's people who are not great examples in the kind of post-conflict environment. Their prosperity may not be well gained, or for example, and I think that this is probably also broader, like a young person wanting to be a performer or a celebrity or a football player, and that's something that you'll find in people who when we talk about, so the film also is part of a collection of films called Generation Africa, which is about young people and migration. So No Simple Way Home is about coming home, but there were also films in the collection about leaving. And you would find young people leaving, and the assumption is usually that they're leaving because the situation in their country is so desperate that they have to leave. But it's not always the case, or not necessarily the case. Sometimes it's a young person, a young man, for example, who's like, I'm going to Europe because I want to be a football player. And that has to do with their dream, or an example that they saw of a somebody You know, this guy is a somebody. He's from my country and he went to Europe and he became a football player. That's what I want to do. Something that, a dream that, you know, human and understandable is what motivated this person to take a journey across the Sahara, where more people die than in the Mediterranean, into like, that's what motivated that movement, is a dream, you know, an aspiration. So we would think and talk about, like, how do we diversify and create more aspirations, make more professions or more paths look aspirational to young people, more than being in the government or being a football player or being a, you know, how do you make diversity of professions viable, you know, something that can that a person can live off or provide for their family with, and something that can look aspirational. So we don't all want to be, let's say in South Sudan, basketball players, which is a very aspirational thing right now. Like the South Sudanese basketball team is like winning, and the basketball court in Juba is like this aspirational space. So more than, so those things as well, not to say that let's not make those things aspirational, but more than basketball players and models and people in positions of power or authority, how do we make other paths aspirational to young people?
Yeah, so
and
illuminating also different future paths for individuals and showing possibilities and opportunities.
Mhm.
Also, your film portrays strong female figures. You're also in the movie, but also your sister and your mother. And I think it was also mentioned yesterday before the screening of the film that it was an inspiration to many women, both in South Sudan and beyond. And I know that also Sarah, Torunn, and Karmalisa are also very engaged in gender issues. So I wanted to ask, what are the gender dimensions and perspectives on the futures of societies torn and raged by conflicts? Because, of course, there's often a focus on women and how women are disproportionately affected by conflicts. But there's also another story that was also portrayed in your film about strong women playing an important role in the futures of new countries being built. So if you could, we start by you.
That was the one space when I looked around when I was in South Sudan where I felt a sense of hope, because there is a lot of despair and really many problems, and it's easy to just look and just see despair. But I encounter women, and the example in the film is young women who would open tea shops, and it's like characteristic of Juba. Like, you just see all these chairs, blue chairs that dot the street, because there's these young women who open these tea shops, and that's how they provide for themselves and for their families. And that gave me a sense of hope, seeing that in the cityscape of Juba. You don't realize that small thing is somebody. That's the economy, you know, or that's an element of the economy that's working in its small way, all these little different spaces, and it tends to be women who pick up and find a way against tremendous odds.
Yeah.
So that was the one space that I felt here is some kind of hope, because even in terms of like what I mentioned earlier about finding like a diversity of aspirations, it's like somebody has to make it work, because you can want to be, I don't know, you can want to be a carpenter, but like, is it going to work in terms of providing, right? And these young women find ways to make it work.
And I thought it was very nice that you made it more visible, you know, because often women are invisible in these contexts. So
Yeah,
it's
and
really nice.
those chairs that dot the street, you don't see them. Like you
Yeah,
get used to
yeah.
them, so
It's the background,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
but there
and
are many
that's what's
things in the
keeping
background,
things
yeah.
from falling apart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Torunn?
Yeah, I mean, of course, gender has been a very stark dimension of the conflict in Afghanistan. I think in both helpful and not so helpful ways, because it's been very geopoliticized also. I think now, I mean, it's difficult to see, in contrast to Akoul, it's difficult to see that much hope. Although I know that you know there is a lot of determination to overturn what the Taliban has imposed on Afghan women. I think it's incredibly sad because during the last 20 years there was so much expansion in women's education, girls' education, and a whole new generation of women who were working, often from very poor backgrounds. They did like what we call in Norway like a class journey. They got education and they often supported their entire family on their income. And now there's very little possibilities for women to work. And I remember I met this woman in Kabul this summer, and she had been a quite high level professional, and you know she had been sent home from her work because the Taliban didn't allow women to work in her ministry. And she was just incredibly depressed. Her entire body language, you could see, you know, she could hardly. She cried during our meeting. She said, like, I have my daughter, you know, she's at university, she wants to quit. She says, look at you, you know, mother, you have, what was the point of all this? Look what happened to you, why should I continue? And she's, you know, I said, what could anyone from abroad do? And she's like, well, either, you know, get us work or get us out of here. And she said that, you know, she's been speaking to the UN and the only thing they could offer her was anti-depression counseling. So that's what she did with her time. So it's very sad, sad to see.
Yeah. Sarah?
Yeah. There's a great part of the film where you are discussing the valorization of your father. And that there are these, you know, statues in his honor everywhere, and the sort of public prominence, you know, that he occupies. And then you turn to your mom and you say, but what about our mother who is here? And that, to my mind, captured so well the way that gender can often operate in these post-conflict environments, where the political discourses are often about the men and who the men are and who the political actors are. And yet it's people like your mom who show up and do the work and often do not have political aspirations. I thought that dialogue about, you know, does she aspire to become the president? And if not her, then whom? You or your sister? You know, this kind of, these set of questions. And, you know, and her response was, I just want to work to eat, and my home is open, and you can come to my home and you see my goats, but this is my humble space, you know? And I really loved that exchange so much, because it really, to my mind, demonstrates how the fallout from conflict often has these gendered aspects where women are shouldering the day-to-day. They have to show up and do the work. And, you know, it's the discourses of freedom and political valor that are sort of men's spaces. And what an injustice that is to the hard work that women are doing every day to not only show up and take care of everyone, but also then to have these moments of mobility into the political sphere, where they become the income earners, or they become the voices of freedom, of change, of a kind of democracy. And so I think that there's a lot that women are doing that goes unrecognized in all of these contexts. And I think that focusing on those moments of real, I don't want to say aspiration, because women are already aspiring, but focusing the lens, moving the gaze away from what the men are doing to what the women are doing, I think will reveal new insights into what democracy can look like, or what freedom can look like, or what society can look like. And so I think that the key to sort of resolving these questions about dreams and future can often land on the shoulders of women, both wittingly and unwittingly.
Yeah, thank you. Carmelisa?
It is so interesting hearing about these different paths and contributions that women give both to the struggle of freedom struggle and in the aftermath. And was just reflecting. So in the context of the freedom fighting in Mozambique, we had a female detachment, and this was not unlike other countries in Africa. And, you know, the whole discussion about African feminisms, you know, these female detachments of freedom fighters are considered sort of proto-feminist movements, or at least pro-women's rights movements, even though some of them or most of them then became sort of aligned with the power that continues, with the group that continues in power. And so they become this very ambiguous, you know, allegiance mostly to the party and less so towards other women, even though they do continue to advocate for women and women's role in society. And the narrative after the independence in Mozambique was a narrative of men and women together, and that there was no society without the two. And of course, we sort of, we were for a time a Marxist-Leninist country, and this was a common narrative in socialist countries of the women's contribution. Of course, and the way it operated was that, you know, there was also this nationalist thinking of family and the family unit and the responsibility of women that kind of put women in a certain role. But at least what I've been reading on about these female detachment women were how this created spaces for them to sort of challenge what would have been sort of the most accepted structures of men at the top and women in domestic space and men in public space. You know, they kind of, many of these women refused to go back to the role of being just wives and being just taking care of the family. They really wanted to have more, a bigger role in society alongside men. And this whole narrative of women and men creating a new society together also, you know, put sort of women in the public space working and doing perhaps things that they wouldn't before. It doesn't mean that it broke away with the patriarchal structures. It just created opportunities, opportunities that some women were very good at a sort of entering and claiming as their own. So, you know, at the same time, there is, as you said, Elina, very well, this awful dimension. There are these also spaces that are claimed and that create opportunities for women. And there's also this invisibility of things that they do that are often not recognized, of course. And for me, what I'm most scared of in the aftermaths is sort of once the conflict dies down and it's a time for reconstruction, sometimes the narrative of the reconstruction tends to try and put the woman back to this imagined structure that is often very patriarchal and sort of trying to take away whatever opportunities that the context has created for them. But the reality is, for example, now in a very impoverished context in which men are not able to fulfill the role that they are supposed to fulfill, it is women that need to step up. It is women, you know, as all of you mentioned, you know, that sort of keep the boats sort of sailing, that either complement or are the breadwinners through these informal works or entrepreneurship. And one of the things that I'm very unhappy about now in Mozambique is how informality has become this criminalized thing, and it has become this other form of violence against women, because sort of state agents kind of keep on ganging up against women and creating new forms of violence and aggression on what are the very few opportunities that people have to sustain themselves.
Yeah, thank you, Carmelise. And I think you also very good point out how the aftermath often is a new struggle for women as well. I'm sorry, we have only 5 minutes left. We had such a interesting conversation for questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, we open up floor for that now. Yes, please.
Oh, thank you. Hello, thank you so much. Okay, testing. So very valuable insights. Thank you so much for that. What I extract from your speeches was that how parents, like education through parents and politics, can shape this dominant narrative about like what we want to move on and what we like want to forget about visions for future of the country. But I was wondering how like you see like how different regions can also become like source for generational conflict, and it also cross-cuts like gender, class, ethnicity. But how would you define the ripe moment in which you began to observe like these efforts for reconciliation and attempts to like change power dynamics? And is there like something that really triggers like talks for peace or something like that? Thank you.
Torunn, I know that you have to leave very soon, so I thought maybe if you have a comment on that.
Yeah, it's really, I think it's my experience is that the settlements really varies, you know. Some settlements are classical power sharing settlements where there might be more flexibility and instability, so there's more scope for young people in some cases to insert themselves, whereas in others it's a victory. And that victory might be victory of different kinds, like in South Sudan, it was a liberation movement. In Afghanistan just now, it is more ambiguous, although I know, of course, the Taliban will call themselves a liberation movement. So I think it's very different. In Afghanistan, there was an interesting moment around 2014 where there was a presidential election. And the one of the presidential candidates, he successfully mobilized youth. Because the government until then had been quite old guard, and there was very little space for young people to enter into government or to get credit for their qualifications. So this president managed to mobilize a lot of young people, and there was a lot of hope when he was inaugurated. But then it very quickly that hope disintegrated because he showed that he was unable to overcome the kind of levels, the networks of corruption and the old kind of patronage politics. And many young people joined this government, but many of them left after a year or two. They became very disillusioned. Others, I think, became tempted by the possibilities of corruption. So there was a moment there, but it didn't last, unfortunately.
Anybody else on reconciliation? Thank you. Any other questions from the audience here? Yes, please.
Thank you. This is a big question, so it may not be possible to provide a quick answer, but obviously South Sudan is in a way an outlier. Other post-colonial independence movements like Katanga or Biafra were not successful. You noted that there has been civil war after independence. Can we draw any conclusions about that debate between those who would like to have seen the post-colonial resolution consider the borders once again that were often drawn by colonial powers with very little thought for the people on the ground, and the alternative that it's just better to stick with the borders we have because drawing new lines is not going to solve the problems. We're just going to have yet new conflicts that will emerge.
Thank you. So borders.
Yeah. So Sudan is really weird and complicated because it was this, at some point it was a Egypt, Britain condominium. And then the new border that was drawn was based on a conflict that was on ethnic and religious lines, people in the north identifying in the majority as Arab and Muslim, and in the south identifying as Christian and African majority. But there's, I mean, it's complicated. Sudan is very diverse. Even South Sudan is diverse, and now Sudan, after the split, is also diverse. And it's difficult to talk about colonial, post-colonial, colonial in a Sudanese context. Sudan is the first country to gain independence in Africa in 1956, but it's that people usually think it's Ghana. But because Sudan is considered part of the Arab world or a bridge between the Arab world and Africa, or not anymore based on this divide, it's really messy and complicated. But the secession, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement vision was not for the secession. The peace agreement that led to the referendum, that led to the dividing of the country, gave the people of the South the decision in a referendum. You decide if you want to split the country. And my father played a big role in this comprehensive peace agreement that was signed in 2005. And he spoke often, there's like lectures that he's done online about a new Sudan, which would have been a diverse, democratic Sudan, no border, no split. And he would have campaigned for that, to not split the country. But the decision would still have been in the referendum in the South. So it would have been to convince people that it is better to not split the country. And it is another thing that we try to explore in the film. Like, why is it that so independence can also have to do with these creating borders. I don't know if there are people, there's Eastern European countries splitting. Who is it? You said that this is your area of expertise.
The former Soviets.
Yes, former Soviets, and like the splitting of countries, and how there's a sense of, once we have our own country, perhaps, I don't know, you correct me if I'm wrong, once we have our own country, I think was the sentiment in our case, everything will be better. Now we have our own country, but that was not the case. And it seems then after we've split, that more splits become a possibility. Like, okay, so now we have our own country. But yeah, these guys are like, no, we don't want those guys. They're the problem, you know? So before it was those guys, now it's these guys. And then that continuous split can keep going. I don't know if there's a possibility of unification or redrawing borders in the future, but it's definitely something to think about, like splitting, seceding, creating different borders, or the borders that were brought in, or the borders that were created. We don't know if they borders are basically, I don't know.
And borders are also always dynamic, right? We imagine them as something static, but they're actually changing all the time, sometimes violently and sometimes not so violently. Unfortunately, I have to say that we have run out of time. But thank you all so much for joining us today and for the insightful conversation. Definitely has given us food for thought for today in this early hour. And before the screening of the movie yesterday, a wish was expressed about how the film might start conversations. And I think what we have seen today, it has definitely started many interesting conversations. And I hope that, and I'm very sure that it will do so also in the future. So thank you so much for joining us, for Sarah, Torunn, who had to leave, and Carmelisa joining us digitally. And we also wish you best of luck with your future film projects, Akoul.
Thank you.
And let's keep the conversations going.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you too.
Thank you.